As promised, this lecture will be about some of the major programs of the Great Society outside of the civil rights programs. Let's look first at health laws that passed in 1965. This is the Health Care Reform Act of 1965 that created both Medicare for the elderly, that is an insurance program paid for in large part by federal dollars and by state dollars, that is a partnership between the feds and the states, paying for Medicare for the elderly and Medicaid for the poor. And here's where we really see that notion of the Great Society being similar to the New Deal, but being motivated by prosperity in the United States. Remember that by 1960, gross national product had more than doubled, and we were awash in cash. Even after a midterm recession under Eisenhower that lasted through the Kennedy years and was being corrected by 1965-66 because of the targeted tax cut to businesses that came in 1964, that Congress passed in 1964, then we saw not only a serious revival in federal money, but the entire economy was awash in cash. And it was awash in cash in the middle class. And so this money in the society was available to support those people who could not support themselves. And we see it in play here, at least the government's idea of what to do to access wealth and to distribute it so that people had what was beginning to be considered a reasonable living standard, that it was the role of government to do that in an era of prosperity. So we see that here with Medicare for the elderly and Medicaid for the poor, two components of the Health Care Reform Act of 1965. We also see both largesse and what some critics have called social engineering in federal aid to education. Now, the federal government had not spent very much money or effort providing direct aid to education at the state level, and there was no national university, no national schools outside of military academies on which federal largesse could go to improve education across the board. However, there were crying needs that states were not meeting for education, and some of this was unintentional, but some of this came about, or we began to notice it as a result of the launch of Sputnik, the first artificial satellite launched into space by the Soviet Union in 1957. The United States Congress immediately responded with the National Defense Education Act of 1958 that provided direct federal support for graduate students in science and technology fields. Expanding on that, from 1963 to 1968, we see the federal government sending money to the states to be used on education, elementary, secondary, and higher education. The feds did not create the Department of Education until the late 1970s, however. Also, one of the most important components of the war on poverty is actually an education program, and that is Head Start. This is an attempt to, use federal largesse, federal money, to give particularly rural and inner city children some institutional support for school preparedness, recognizing that many times there is a cycle of poverty and undereducation in many poor areas that it's almost impossible to break. And so this is an attempt to break that cycle of poverty and miseducation by providing reading readiness and numeracy and other basic skills in an institutional setting. Now, Head Start was part of the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964, and so it really belongs on the War on Poverty, but it's truly an educational system. Another educational act is the National Endowment for the Arts, proposed and passed in 1965, and the National Endowment for the Humanities, also proposed and passed in 1965. The NEA and the NEH operate state by state. In Alabama, for example, the National Endowment for the Arts state partner is the Alabama Council on the Arts, and the NEH state partner in Alabama is the Alabama Humanities Foundation, on which board I sat from 2002 until the end of 2008. The National Endowment for the Humanities makes direct grants. It also grants money, as does the Endowment for the Arts. They make direct grants to artists and to scholars and to other people doing humanities projects and arts projects. And they grant money to the state organizations to provide for operating funds and to allow the states to have a say through the board on each of the state organizations in how re-grant money is spent as well. So these are cultural things. The NEA and NEH is federal support for culture and education, or for cultural education, or cultural projects, which is a new thing under the sun for the United States. Finally, the most important act of the Great Society, except maybe for the Civil Rights Acts, is, and the thing that is most telling and most emblematic, I guess, of the Great Society is the so-called War on Poverty, which is all bundled up into the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964. The EOA of 64 created the Office of Economic Opportunity, and Johnson pulled Sergeant Shriver, who was a Kennedy relative, from the Peace Corps into the OEO as its first and only head. The Office of Economic Opportunity worked at the local level by providing funds for community action programs. These were locally proposed economic development projects that received federal grants, and their operational structure, which was supposed to be a big committee, was required to have quote unquote maximum participation by local poor folks. These community action programs, CAP is what they were called. These CAPs were developed by local groups, usually in association with local political leaders, which became problematic in many places in the South. These CAPs were supposed to have a board. That board was supposed to be connected with the local political leaders, and it was supposed to have maximum feasible participation by the people who would receive the services. And what were the services? Economic development. It was supposed to be bottom-up economic development. And many of the CAPs were things like starting cooperative businesses in rural areas, the old Warehouse Act, the old program of the Knights of Labor, the Grange, and the Agricultural Wheel. And that was pretty prominent in Alabama, for example, in Mississippi and Georgia as well, these rural states. Others, particularly in the urban areas, were about urban renewal, cleaning up areas, establishing job opportunities, job training, and things like that. Sometimes, and they operated off of direct federal grants through the Office of Economic Opportunity. Another component of the war on poverty that was part of the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964 was the development of Job Corps and the Neighborhood Youth Corps. Both Job Corps and Neighborhood Youth Corps were modeled on the New Deal's Civilian Conservation Corps. And they were to supply, they were aimed at first at 18 to 24-year-olds, and then that expanded from 16 up to about 28 with vocational training. That's particularly true of the Job Corps. And Neighborhood Youth Corps was to provide summer jobs and to try to teach work skills, sometimes as simple as show up to work on time and ready to work. Those kinds of cultural skills that were necessary. So there's the Job Corps and the Neighborhood Youth Corps, both of which were components of the Economic Opportunity Act. Work-study programs for college kids who needed some support but were not able to get in on any of the financial aid programs, which were very few and far between. Remember also that the Economic Opportunity Act, which provided work-study funding, preceded many of the acts that were later created to assist college students. So work-study is one of the first direct federal assistance to students, and what it did was to provide the money that a student could use. Actually, it provided money to colleges. Colleges would then find jobs for students on campus. A lot of library assistance or work studies, for example. And many students now, when they do their financial aid package, have a combination of grants, loans, and work study. I don't know if this affects any of you listening to this lecture, but I know it does affect students in many brick and mortar situations. Another component of the Economic Opportunity Act is VISTA, Volunteers in Service to America, which was very much like a domestic Peace Corps, in which idealistic young people and sometimes older people would volunteer for a small stipend to work in poverty-stricken areas within the United States. This took a lot of middle-class kids and brought them into inner cities where they could work sometimes with these community action programs. It took them out into the rural areas where they could work with community action programs, or they could work on projects that were created outside of the community action program arena. Lastly, the war on poverty provided food stamps. This was a modernization and an updating of a pilot program that had begun in 1961 under the Kennedy administration. One of the components of food stamps was that it replaced the dole of government food. Government had been throughout the 1940s and 50s buying dairy products, for example, in order to support the prices, turning that into cheese and then doling that out to poor people as a giveaway program. But food stamps stopped that and leveraged federal government monies to go to private businesses in a way that was hooked into the consumer culture. That is, instead of paying the dairy industry and the cheese industry to buy excess product and then give it away, food stamps gave discounts on scrip, basically, to consumers who then could go to local grocery stores and buy products off the shelves. Now, there certainly were restrictions on the kinds of products that could be bought directly with food stamps. This was, again, a federal-state partnership, so it varied from state to state with how much money was actually available. And it allowed the needy to purchase discounted scrip, like ration stamps, that could be redeemed for food at grocery stores. So this, you can see within some of these changes that in addition to being based on prosperity, the Great Society, much more so than the New Deal, was based on the notion of the consumer as the economic engine of the United States. So instead of paying businesses and producers like the New Deal did, the war on poverty in particular paid consumers and allowed them to spend money where they thought best, within certain bounds. It's a different direction in the way the money was spent. Okay, with that, we have finished these two short lectures on the Great Society and on the programs of the Great Society, beginning with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and 1965 Voting Rights Acts, and ending with the very large and very emblematic Economic Opportunity Act, also passed in 1964. And as always, thank you for your attention.